something quiet has been happening in the way men move through the world, and most of them can't articulate it even when they feel it pressing against their chest every morning. You can see it in the way a man carries himself through a conversation with a woman he desires. The slight forward lean, the too quick responses, the way his body seems to bend toward her approval even as his mind tells him he's being confident. You can see it in the pauses before he sends a text message, in the careful calibration of his words, in the 3 drafts he writes and deletes before settling on something that sounds casual but took him 15 minutes to construct. There's a heaviness in this, a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work or lack of sleep, but from the constant management of how he appears, how he's received, whether he's doing enough or too much or exactly right. The modern man who desires a woman often finds himself trapped in a performance he didn't audition for, playing a role whose script keeps changing. The cost of this performance is something he doesn't recognize until it's already been extracted from him. He becomes smaller in these moments, not in any way she could name or that he would admit, but in a way that registers somewhere deeper than language. His friends might not notice. His family wouldn't understand if he tried to explain it, but he feels it the way his life starts to organize itself around her responses, her moods, her availability, her perception of him. He tells himself this is what investment looks like, what showing up means, what separating him from all the other men requires. And perhaps in some previous era, in some different arrangement of human relations, this might have been true, but something fundamental has shifted in the architecture of desire. And the man who hasn't noticed this shift keeps running the same programs his grandfather ran in a completely different operating system, wondering why nothing compiles correctly anymore. Otto Weininger understood something about desire that most men spend their entire lives avoiding. Writing in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century as old certainties collapsed and new confusions arose about sex, identity, and power, Weininger saw that emotional investment without detachment was not love, but a kind of slavery. He saw that the man who orients his entire psychological landscape around a woman's presence doesn't become more attractive to her. He becomes a mirror in which she sees her own power reflected. Mirrors don't inspire desire, they inspire utility. Weininger's work was controversial, often misunderstood, sometimes deliberately misread, but buried in his observations about sex and character was a truth that remains surgical in its precision. A man who cannot maintain emotional distance from what he desires will always be ruled by it, and what rules you cannot respect you. This isn't about coldness, it isn't about game-playing manipulation or emotional unavailability as a strategy. It's about something much older and much simpler. The recognition that power, real power, the kind that generates respect and attraction rather than comfort and familiarity, lives in the space between wanting something and needing it. The modern man has forgotten how to occupy this space. He's been taught that distance is cruelty, that detachment is trauma, that genuine intimacy requires complete emotional transparency at all times. And so he approaches women with his entire interior on display, his needs visible, his investment obvious, his desire legible from across the room. He thinks this is honesty. He believes this is a vulnerability. What he doesn't realize is that he's handed over every negotiating tool he had before the negotiation even began. Watch what happens to a man in the first 6 weeks of dating someone he genuinely wants. He starts checking his phone more frequently. His availability becomes elastic plans with friends get moved, gym sessions get skipped, work projects get deprioritized, all in service of being present when she reaches out. He tells himself he's making space for something important, and maybe he is, but what he doesn't see is how this availability reads to her. It doesn't read as devotion. It reads as confirmation that her time is more valuable than his, that her attention is the prize and his is the entry fee. The man thinks he's building a connection. What he's actually creating is a hierarchy where he's already positioned himself on the lower rung. Weininger would say this is the moment the man stops being a person and becomes a function. He exists now primarily in relation to her needs, her schedule, her emotional weather patterns. And the tragedy is that the more he invests in this dynamic, the less interested she becomes, Not because she's cruel or strategic, but because desire doesn't work that way. Desire requires resistance. It requires the friction of two separate gravitational fields pulling against each other. When one person collapses their field entirely and orbits around the other, there's no friction left, just the dull certainty of possession without pursuit. I work with men who describe this feeling as a slow suffocation. They can't point to a single moment where things went wrong. She accepted them. She's still responding to texts. They're still seeing each other, but something imperceptible has shifted. Her responses take longer. The warmth has a practiced quality. Sex, if it's still happening, feels more like maintenance than hunger. And the man, sensing this cooling, does precisely the wrong thing. He increases his investment, thinking the problem is that he hasn't shown enough, hasn't given enough, hasn't made his feelings clear enough. He plans more elaborate dates. He texts more frequently. He initiates deeper conversations. He tries to manufacture intimacy through effort. And with each attempt, he watches her pull back slightly, not in any dramatic way, just a subtle recalibration of distance that he can feel but can't name. What he doesn't understand is that he's trying to solve a problem of mathematics with more of the same equation. He's trying to generate attraction through investment when attraction was generated by its opposite, by the version of himself that existed before he decided she was the prize worth reorganizing his life around. Weininger observed that the man who maintains his center, who keeps his mission and purpose as the organizing principle of his life, even in the presence of desire, generates an entirely different response. This man doesn't ignore the woman. He doesn't play games, but his availability isn't infinite. His attention isn't a given. His emotional state doesn't rise and fall with her texts or lack thereof. He exists in his own right, and her presence in his life is an addition to something already full rather than the thing that fills an emptiness. This distinction seems small from the outside, but it's everything from the inside. The man operating from the detachment doesn't wait by his phone. He doesn't rearrange his week around her schedule. He doesn't drop his plans when she suddenly becomes free. Not because he's following some strategy, not because he's trying to appear valuable, but because his life actually has structure and direction independent of her participation in it. And paradoxically, though it's only a paradox if you misunderstand how attraction works, this is what makes him magnetic. She can feel the difference between a man who's fitting her into his life and a man who's restructuring his life around her. The former suggests he has something worth fitting her into. The latter suggests he was waiting for someone to give his life meaning. Most men operate from a fundamental misunderstanding about what women want. They think women wish to devotion, availability, emotional transparency, and constant reassurance of their feelings. And in some abstract sense, women do say they want these things, but what people say they want and what actually stirs their desire are often entirely different. Weininger understood that women, like all humans, want what they can't fully possess, what maintains some degree of mystery, what suggests depths they haven't fully explored. The man who makes himself completely known, who offers total availability, who collapses all distance between his interior and his exterior, gives her nothing to wonder about, nothing to pursue, nothing to discover. He becomes known, and the known, no matter how good or kind or loving, doesn't generate the kind of tension that desire requires. This is why the man she calls when she's upset isn't always the man she wants when she's hungry. This is why the boyfriend who always says yes doesn't create the same charge as the man who sometimes says no. This is why emotional transparency without boundaries doesn't build intimacy. It makes a kind of therapeutic relationship in which she processes her feelings with you while reserving her desire for someone who hasn't given her everything yet. The mechanism by which a man loses himself in this dynamic is gradual and almost invisible. It starts with minor compromises. He was going to the gym at 6 in the morning, but she texted late last night, and he stayed up talking, and now he's too tired. He was working on a project that mattered to him, but he needed help with something, and his thing could wait. He was planning to spend the weekend pursuing something challenging and worthwhile, but she's free, and he doesn't want to seem unavailable. Each choice seems reasonable, even admirable, is being supportive, present, caring. But the aggregate effect is that his life starts to hollow out. The things that gave him substance, that made him interesting, that created the foundation of confidence, she was initially attracted to these things, quietly disappeared, replaced by availability and accommodation. And the cruelest part is that she might not even notice this happening. She's not keeping score. She's not deliberately extracting his purpose from him. But on some level below conscious awareness, she registers that the man she's with now is less than the man she was initially drawn to. He's nicer, more available, and more willing to please. But something vital has been traded away in exchange for her approval. The psychological script here is simple but devastating. The man believes that desire is earned through investment. He thinks that if he gives more, shows more, and proves more, he'll secure her interest and build something stable. But desire doesn't respond to investment the way economic markets do. Desire responds to uncertainty, to challenge, to the presence of something that hasn't been fully conquered. The more he invests, the more certain she becomes of his availability, and certainty is the death of attraction. Weininger would say the man has confused two entirely different forms of relating theirs. The love that exists between equals who maintain their separateness. There's the devotion that exists between a worshipper and his god. The first creates erotic tension. The second creates gratitude at best, contempt at worst. The man thinks he's building the first by engaging in the second, and by the time he realizes the error, he's already structured his entire emotional economy around her responses, her moods, her validation. He's no longer a man with a life she finds attractive. He's become a resource she's learned to depend on, and resources don't inspire hunger, they inspire maintenance. I once spoke to a man who described the moment he realized what had happened to him. He'd been with a woman for 8 months. He'd reorganized his entire life around the relationship, moved closer to her, changed his work schedule to match hers, dropped hobbies that took him away from her, spent every available evening either with her or available to her. He thought he was building something serious. But one night, she told him, in the middle of an otherwise normal conversation, that she didn't feel the spark anymore. She said he was terrific, that he did everything right, that any woman would be lucky to have him. And then she left. What destroyed him wasn't the loss itself, but the recognition that everything he'd done to keep her had actually pushed her away. He'd become too known, too available, too sure-in. She knew exactly where he'd be, what he'd say, how he'd react. There was no mystery left, no tension, no distance to cross. He'd given her everything, and in doing so, had given her nothing to want. The man she started seeing a month later looked similar on paper, same age, same profession, similar values. But the difference was that this new man didn't rearrange his life. He had plans that didn't include her. He had priorities that took precedence. He was interested but not consumed, and she pursued him with an intensity she'd never shown the first man, not because the second man was better, but because he maintained the space that desire requires. This pattern plays out across the entire landscape of modern dating and relationships, but most men are too close to see it. They're caught in the granular experience of daily choices, daily texts, and daily negotiations about whose schedule matters more. They don't see the larger architecture, the way these small choices accumulate into a structure that predetermines the outcome. Weininger saw this architecture clearly. He understood that the man who makes a woman the center of his existence hands her a power she didn't ask for and often doesn't want. It burdens her with responsibility for his emotional state, his happiness, and his sense of self. And more importantly, it kills her ability to see him as separate, as other, as unknown, all the qualities that made him interesting in the first place. She becomes not a woman relating to a man, but a woman managing someone who's become dependent on her for his psychological stability. The relationship stops being erotic and starts being therapeutic. She stops being his lover and starts being his emotional support system. And no one desires their therapist. The wider system reinforces this confusion at every level. Modern dating culture, built on apps and algorithms and infinite choice, has made desire itself a commodity and attention the currency. Men are taught to compete for female attention by demonstrating investment, by showing they're willing to put in effort, by proving they're not like all the other guys who want one thing. The entire frame is backwards. It starts from the premise that male attention is abundant and worthless, while female attention is scarce and valuable, and that men must therefore bid up their investment to stand out. But this frame creates exactly the dynamic that kills attraction. It positions men as supplicants and women as arbiters, and no one is attracted to someone who's already positioned themselves beneath you. The man who operates inside this frame has already lost before the first message is sent. He's playing a game where the only winning move is not to play the way the game tells you to play. Social media amplifies this dynamic to pathological levels. Every woman with a phone has hundreds of men who are interested, paying attention, and available. The sheer volume of male availability makes any individual man's attention seem worthless unless he's extraordinary or unless he's scarce. The man who doesn't understand this tries to compete by being more available, more responsive, more invested. He thinks he's standing out. What he's actually doing is blending into the mass of undifferentiated availability. The man who understands the dynamics does the opposite. He becomes less available, more selective with his time, more willing to walk away, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of actual self-respect. He recognizes that a marketplace flooded with availability doesn't need more availability. It needs scarcity. It requires the presence of a man who doesn't need the validation the marketplace offers. And this scarcity, this detachment, this willingness to exist independent of female approval, this is what registers as power. Weininger would say that what we're watching is playing out a fundamental truth about desire. It's always structured by inequality, by difference, by distance. Not inequality of worth or value as human beings, but inequality of investment, inequality of need. The person who needs the relationship less has more power in the relationship. This isn't cynical. It's not a moral judgment. It's simply how desire works at the psychological level. The moment both people need each other equally, desire doesn't stabilize into perfect balance. It collapses into comfort, into friendship, into a partnership that's valuable in many ways, but no longer erotic. The charge that existed at the beginning required an imbalance. It required uncertainty. It required one person to wonder if they fully have the other. And in modern dating, men have been trained to eliminate this uncertainty as quickly as possible, to make their interest clear, to communicate their feelings, and to pursue actively, all of which destroys the very thing they're trying to build. The cost of ignoring this reality is not just failed relationships or dating frustration. The price is the slow erosion of a man's respect for himself. Every time he compromises his schedule for someone who wouldn't do the same for him, he registers on some level that his time is worth less. Every time he texts first, initiates plans, pursues while she responds, he reinforces a hierarchy where his interest is the constant and hers is the variable. Every time he explains himself, justifies his choices, and seeks her approval for decisions about his own life, he hands over a piece of his autonomy. These microtransactions seem insignificant in isolation, but they accumulate. They build a structure of self-perception where he becomes someone who needs permission, who requires validation, who can't trust his own judgment without external confirmation. And the person least attracted to this version of him is the woman he's doing all this for. She can feel that he's no longer standing on his own foundation. She can sense that he's borrowed his sense of self from her responses. And whatever she might say about wanting a sensitive, available, emotionally open man, her desire tells a different story. Her desire responds to the man who doesn't need her to complete him, who includes her in a life that was already full, who would survive and maybe even thrive if she left tomorrow. This is where Weininger's concept of detachment becomes not just philosophical but practical. Detachment doesn't mean not caring. It doesn't mean emotional unavailability or manufactured indifference. It means maintaining a center of gravity that exists independent of her presence. It means your happiness, your purpose, your sense of self don't rise and fall based on whether she texted back how the last conversation went or whether she seemed warm or distant. It means you have work that matters to you, friendships that sustain you, goals that organize your time, standards you won't compromise regardless of who's watching. When a man has this, the relationship with a woman becomes supplementary rather than central. She adds to his life rather than defining it. And this shift in position changes everything about how she experiences him. She's no longer the sun in his solar system. She's a planet in orbit around something larger. And paradoxically, this is what makes her want to get closer to him, to understand what that larger thing is, to figure out why she doesn't have the power over him that she's used to having. Most men hear this and interpret it as instruction to play games, to pretend not to care, to manufacture scarcity through strategic unavailability. This completely misses the point. The power of detachment comes from it being real, not performed. A man who's genuinely invested in his mission, who has things in his life that matter as much or more than the woman he's dating, doesn't have to pretend to be busy or act like he doesn't care. His life actually demands his attention. His priorities actually take precedence sometimes. His boundaries actually exist because they protect something valuable. The woman can feel the difference between a man who's playing hard to get and a man who's actually hard to get because his life is complete. The first creates suspicion and game playing. The second creates respect and curiosity. The first is a strategy that collapses the moment she tests it. The second is a structure of life that remains stable regardless of her participation. Notice when you start checking your phone compulsively after sending a message. Notice when you rearrange your plans because she became available. Notice when you feel anxiety about whether you said the right thing, revealed too much, or didn't show enough interest. Notice when you're crafting your responses for maximum effect rather than simply responding honestly. These are all signs that you've handed your center to her. These are all moments where your emotional state is being determined by her responses rather than by your own sense of direction. Stop pretending this is what connection requires. Stop telling yourself that real intimacy means making her the most essential thing in your life. Real intimacy happens between two people who each have lives worth living independently, who choose to include each other in those lives without collapsing their own structure in the process. Refuse to be infinitely available. This doesn't mean being rude or dismissive. It means that when you have plans, you keep them. When you're working on something important, you finish it before responding to non-urgent messages. When you set boundaries around your time, energy, or priorities, you maintain them even when it would be easier to compromise. The woman who respects you will respect these boundaries. The woman who doesn't respect them is showing you exactly how the relationship will function if you allow her to set all the terms. Allow her to react to your boundaries without rushing to manage her reaction. When you say no to something because it doesn't work for you, and she gets upset or distant or passive-aggressive, resist the urge to immediately fix it, to explain more, to justify your choice, to find a compromise that lets you keep her approval. Let her feel whatever she feels. Let there be space, distance, and more and uncertainty. This is not cruelty. This is allowing both of you to exist as separate people with separate needs. The man who can't tolerate her disapproval will eventually find himself unable to exist independently. Begin to move as if your life is the thing worth protecting. Most men structure their lives reactively. They build a default existence and then rearrange it whenever a woman enters the picture. The man who understands power does the opposite. He creates a life around his mission, goals, and standards, then evaluates whether a woman fits into that structure rather than immediately restructuring everything to accommodate her. This isn't about being rigid or inflexible. It's about having something solid enough that it doesn't dissolve the moment desire enters the picture. When you operate this way, the woman who enters your life either rises to the structure you've built or she doesn't. And if she doesn't, you have your answer without having to sacrifice what makes you valuable. The tragedy of most modern men is that they sacrifice their structure first, thinking it will make them more attractive, and then, too late, discover that it was the structure that made them appealing in the first place. If you ignore this, if you continue operating from the premise that desire is earned through investment and availability, you will find yourself 5 years from now in a version of life that feels smaller than it should. You'll be in relationships where you give more than you receive, where her needs structure the entire dynamic, where you become someone who exists primarily in relation to someone else rather than in your own right. You'll wonder why women lose interest after a few months, why the ones who stay seem more grateful than passionate, and why you feel a quiet resentment building even in relationships that look successful from the outside. You'll blame the women, or dating apps, or modern culture, but the real problem will be that you never learned to maintain yourself as separate, as detached, as whole, independent of female approval. You'll have become the kind of man who needs permission to exist entirely, who measures his worth by whether someone else validates it, who can't trust his own direction without external confirmation. And this version of yourself will not be happier or more connected. It will be lonelier in the specific way that comes from abandoning yourself to avoid abandonment by others. If you answer this, if you take what Weininger understood and apply it not as tactics but as structure, you will find yourself 5 years from now living in a completely different arrangement. Your life will be quieter in some ways, less socially validated and less concerned with what anyone else thinks about your choices. You'll have fewer people in your inner circle, but the ones who remain will respect rather than manage you. You'll have walked away from relationships that required you to be less than whole, and while those departures hurt in the moment, you'll look back and recognize them as course corrections that saved years of slow compromise. The women in your life will respond to you differently, not because you're playing a role, but because you're no longer performing approval-seeking behaviors. There will be less chasing, less explaining, and less negotiating. There will be more clarity, more respect, more of the kind of tension that desire requires. You'll notice that the relationships that form around this version of you are fundamentally different. They don't require constant maintenance or emotional management or the suppression of your own needs. They're built on mutual respect between people who each have something worth protecting. And this, not the fantasy of merger and completion that modern culture sells, is what sustainable attraction looks like. Otto Weininger's central insight remains as precise now as it was in Vienna a century ago. A man who cannot maintain emotional distance from what he desires will be ruled by it, and what rules you destroys your power. The modern man approaches women from a position of need disguised as generosity, offering his entire interior as proof of his worthiness, not realizing that this offering is precisely what makes him unworthy in the economy of desire. She does not kill your purpose by demanding too much. She reflects its absence by filling the space where purpose should have been. The man who organizes his life around a woman's presence does not become more attractive by demonstrating his commitment. He becomes the architecture she walks through without noticing, functional and comfortable, and utterly without charge. And the moment you recognize this pattern operating in your own life is the moment everything changes. Not because you'll suddenly become successful with women, but because you'll stop structuring your existence around their approval. You'll reclaim the center you didn't realize you'd given away. You'll rebuild the foundation that enables sustained attraction. If this cuts through something you've been feeling but couldn't name, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, share this with someone who needs the same clarity. Subscribe to keep this work alive for the men still moving through the confusion. The work here exists in the space between what we're told to believe about desire and what actually drives it. And the men who find this space find something more valuable than romantic success. They feed the version of themselves that doesn't need someone else's desire to confirm their worth. That is the beginning of power. That is what detachment protects. That is what the modern world has trained you to surrender, refuse,